Hi, I'm Mark Bays with Oklahoma Forestry Services, and now is a really great time to be out looking at our trees, pruning our trees, and just doing a little bit of that work that, it's the end of the winter time, spring is here. So I just thought we'd take a little bit of time with you to go through some basic pruning techniques. You want to make sure that whenever you prune that tree, you do so with just a few little tips. We're going to go over those tips in just a little bit. But before doing that, I just wanted to go over some of the different tools that you might be using. So one of the things you want to do is there are so many tools out there. And it's mind-boggling when you go out and just take a look at all the different saws that might be available and the hand clippers. So one of the things I want to talk about are some of those. Now these are pole saws here. This is a brand that makes them, and it's slightly curved here. So when you pull back on the branch, that's what actually does the cutting, and these are very sharp teeth on that. Some of the tools, some of the saws that are out there are very straight. And so what this is good for is it's so straight, if you have a tight union of a branch, you can put this in that tight union and it's easy to get to. Here's another curved pole saw. It's for smaller branches. And this one is slightly curved, just a little bit more, a little bit thinner. Again, it can get into some real tight branches. Some of the smaller branches that you'll use are these loppers. And there's two kinds of loppers. There's an anvil lopper and a cutting lopper. And I prefer these because these actually cut through the branch. And I'll show you just a minute how to use that when we cut some of those branches. For smaller branches, of course, you've always got your hand tools here. For elevated, if you wanted to get up into the upper part of the tree, there's so many of these extension poles that are available. So with extension pole saws, you can extend them out to whatever length. This is about 15 feet. This can actually extend all the way out to 24 feet tall. So you can reach quite high into the tree without ever having to leave the ground. And that's really the safest way to prune some of those upper branches like that. Now, in doing any of this kind of tree work, you also want to make sure you have the proper personal protection equipment. You always want to make sure you protect your eyes, because when you're sawing anywhere on a windy day like this, I might even be sawing low like this, and the wind can blow up sawdust in my eyes. So you always want to make sure that you protect your eyes. And you can even look really cool when you're doing it too. So don't be afraid of doing a little bit of fashion. The other thing, always want to protect your hands. So a good pair of gloves, there's a lot of different varieties out there. I prefer leather, other types of gloves are out there. So you want to protect your hands. Now, we're not going to be using a chainsaw today, but if you happen to be using a chainsaw, you would definitely want to make sure to protect your ears. And also, there's chaps, that you put chaps around your legs, and just make sure you're very careful you operating a chainsaw. The other thing you might want to have is a hard hat. So that's kind of basically, just real quickly, the kind of equipment that we'll be using today. I want to show you a couple techniques now that you can use whenever you prune a tree. And I think the first thing that I'll show you is how to do a 3-cut technique on a larger branch. So now that we've taken a look at some of the equipment, what do you do when you actually get to the tree? There's some things that you need to consider. First and foremost, it's always important to remove all the dead that you see on a tree, because that's a vector for insects and decay that can get into it. And you can see this is on a green ash tree, and this is obviously dead. There's no leaves on it. It breaks. It's really brittle. So that's the first thing you want to do, is remove all the dead. And then you take a look at the crossing branches, because those crossing branches can create open wounds in a tree where more problems can move into that. So once you remove the dead and the crossing branches, then you want to open up the inner part of the tree to allow more wind to move through that tree. So those are the 3 basic things that you want to do whenever you prune on any size tree. And the older the tree is, you probably don't want to prune it as much as a younger tree. And so you hear this 1/3 rule of thumb a lot. Pruning your roses, pruning your lawn. I'm a little bit more conservative when it comes to trees. I like to do more of a 20 to 25% in a given year, because that's where the food production of that tree is in the leaves, and you don't want to remove too much of that food. So let's take a look now on this one bottom branch, and I'm going to demonstrate the 3-cut technique on it. So this is about a 3-inch diameter branch. And so I want to use the 3-cut technique on that, because if I was just to cut this, which is where my final cut was to be, there's so much weight on it that it might strip down and open up a cavity on the main trunk of the tree, and that's what you're really trying to avoid. So in the 3-cut technique, you find a place a little bit away from it, you come up underneath it, and you cut maybe about no more than 1/4 to 1/3 of the way through the trunk on the bottom section of that. So when you get to about that point, you see here, that's a little bit more than 1/3. So then you make your second cut just on the outside of that, and then what the hopes is when that tree breaks off, is that it won't strip any bark on the lower end on that. And this is true on both dead branches or particularly live branches. And that's a nice clean cut. It didn't strip any of the bark off there. So we've got most of the weight off of that tree now. Now we have to make that last and final cut. So every time you remove a branch, you do what's called target pruning. You're looking for the branch collar. There's a branch bark ridge on a tree, which is right where the bark from the main stem to this branch comes in contact. That's the branch bark ridge. You never want to cut into that. The branch collar is the swollen area connected to that connects that branch to the main trunk of the tree. And you want to make that pruning cut just on the outside of the swelling. So that, and there's no particular angle on this. The branch will tell you what angle. Used to be, they say cut straight up and down. You want a flush cut. None of that is true. Each branch angle is independent, and so you have to look at that carefully on every branch that you remove. And make a nice finished clean cut just like that. So you see here now where I did not cut into the branch bark ridge. It's a little bit of an angle, and that should close off that wound quite nicely. So now I'd like to demonstrate how to make a proper cut on a dead branch, and this just happens to be up in the tree a little bit, so I'm using my pole saw. The one thing to remember, whenever you're removing dead out of a tree, you do not want to cut into the live tissue, because then you will create more problems. The tree is starting to close that branch off a lot of times. So on this nub up here, this small branch up here that I'm getting ready to cut, you can see right there where I'm pointing that the tree is already trying to close that branch off. So I'm making the cut just on the outside of that, being very careful not to cut into that live tissue. So even though that looks like there might be just a little bit of stub like that, I was really careful about not cutting into the live tissue, and that's what you always want to do whenever you're removing dead. So once you've removed the dead, now you look for the crossing branches. And you can see here on this particular branch here, this was not properly cut. That was just cut in the middle of the branch, and so there's a little bit of dead there. So I want to remove this part of it. But if you look down here, you also see this same branch is rubbing with this other branch down here. So I need to remove this whole thing since they're rubbing together. Now I'm going to go ahead and use a lopper, and this is the scissor type lopper cuts. Whenever you use these, you want to make sure that the cutting end is on the inside of the branch where you're leaving. That way you get the cleanest cut on that branch that's up there. So I'll go ahead and just lighten the load here. Not that it's necessary, but I just want to open it up just a little bit for me so I can get in there. So just make a few cuts like that. Remove that, so you see how that's pulled out away from that. Give me a little bit more working room in here. So I'll be making that right on that branch collar here. So I'll come up here and just make the cut like that. So you can see it's right outside that branch collar. That wound should close off really nicely. Now looking on this same branch here, you see this one coming down here, and that's also rubbing on that larger branch. So I'm going to go ahead and get my saw, and I'll go ahead and remove this. So this is the branch I'm going to remove now because it's rubbing. But if you look closely here, you see that it doesn't have that swelling, that branch collar on this. This is what's called a codominant branch. So in that particular case, you don't have that swelling to cut just on the outside, so you have to use your best judgment to go ahead and cut it as close, but not into this other branch that you're remaining. Now this is the importance of having special tools. So this is the one I'm using here, since this is a real tight union, and that long slender one, it's going to easily allow me to get in here and make that proper cut. Now I'm going to go ahead and just reduce the weight here. Not that it's necessary, but I just want to have a little bit more open area to work with. And I'll get in here, slide it in, and make that cut. It's really the best case scenario on a codominant stem. You want to get as close as you can to this, still cutting it at an angle, but not damaging any more than you have to. You can see here that on this flowering crabapple that it's starting to close that previous cutoff quite nicely. Well, some species, and crabapples are one of those, that even if you make a proper pruning cut, you'll see that it's starting to sucker here. And these suckers or water sprouts, whatever you want to call them, it's always important to remove those. So just to recap now, you always want to make sure that you remove the dead first, then the crossing branches like we did, and then open up the center part of the tree, particularly those water sprouts that are taking away nutrients from the other part of the tree. And always make sure that you're very conservative in your pruning. You never want to take out too much. So I'd like to stick more along lines of that 20 to 25%. I hope this has really been helpful. I've hoped you learned a little bit of something. If you have any other questions, please, there's a number of fact sheets you can go to. You can call Oklahoma Forestry Services, but let's get out. It's the right time of year. Let's get out and prune our trees. So all the pruning that we've been doing today is really with our feet firmly on the ground. If you don't have an extension saw to get up to some of those higher branches, we'd encourage you to go ahead and call a professional.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.